My son called me too stupid to attend his biggest business meeting of the year. But what he didn't know was that I was secretly his company's largest investor, and I was about to pull every single penny out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The words still echoed in my mind as I sat in my modest kitchen in Millbrook Heights, staring at the investment portfolio spread across my dining table. $47 million. That's how much I had quietly invested in Pinnacle Digital Solutions over the past 3 years, the tech startup that my son Damien had built from the ground up. He had no idea that Aurora Investments LLC, the mysterious venture capital firm that had been his company's financial lifeline, was actually me, his supposedly clueless mother, Evelyn Hartwell. The irony was suffocating. Just 12 hours ago, I had been standing outside the gleaming glass doors of the Meridian Tower in downtown Riverside City, dressed in my best navy blazer, clutching a leather portfolio containing the latest quarterly reports I'd prepared as his silent partner. I had come to surprise him, to finally reveal that his biggest supporter had been right under his nose all along. Instead, I got the shock of my life. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Damien had asked, his voice sharp with irritation as he spotted me in the lobby. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, looking every inch the successful CEO he'd become. Behind him stood 3 other people, a woman in her 30s with platinum blonde hair who I recognized as his business partner, Cassandra Vale, and 2 men in expensive suits who were clearly the Japanese investors he'd been courting for months. "I thought I could sit in on your meeting," I had said, my voice bright with excitement. "I've been following the tech industry lately, and I'd love to learn more about what you're building." The embarrassment that flashed across his face was like a physical slap. Cassandra whispered something in his ear, and I caught her rolling her eyes. One of the investors checked his watch impatiently. "Mom," Damien said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper, "this is a $20 million deal. These people flew in from Tokyo specifically for this presentation. I can't have you sitting there asking basic questions about things you don't understand. You'd make us look unprofessional." I felt my cheeks burn, but I pressed on. "Damien, I think you'd be surprised by what Look," he interrupted, glancing nervously at his waiting colleagues. "I appreciate your interest, I really do, but this isn't a community college business class. This is serious money, serious people. You're too." He paused, searching for a diplomatic way to crush my spirit. "You're too unfamiliar with this world to add any value. Maybe stick to your book club discussions instead?" Cassandra had actually snickered at that comment. The sound cut through me like glass. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hartwell," she said with fake sweetness, "but Damien's right. Today's presentation involves complex financial modeling, AI integration strategies, and international market penetration analysis. It might be a bit over your head." The Japanese investors were growing visibly restless. One of them said something in rapid Japanese to his colleague, and I didn't need a translation to understand their annoyance. "I'll call you later, Mom," Damien said dismissively, already turning away. "Maybe we can grab dinner this weekend, and I'll explain some of the basics to you then." And just like that, I was dismissed. Sent away like a child who had wandered into the adults' conversation. I stood there in that marble lobby, watching my son disappear into the elevator with his "serious money, serious people," while security guards politely but firmly suggested I might want to find the exit. But here's what Damien didn't know as he delivered his presentation to those Tokyo investors. Here's what Cassandra didn't know as she snickered at my supposed ignorance. Here's what none of them knew as they discussed their financial modeling in that 42nd floor conference room. I wasn't just some retired widow who spent her days reading romance novels and tending to her garden in suburban Millbrook Heights. I was Evelyn Hartwell, former chief financial officer of North Star Enterprises, one of the largest tech conglomerates on the West Coast. For 28 years, I had managed portfolios worth over $2 billion. I had negotiated deals with companies in 17 countries. I had been the first woman to serve on North Star's board of directors, and when I retired at 58, I had walked away with a severance package and stock options that most people couldn't even comprehend. But more importantly, I was the secret genius behind Aurora Investments LLC. Over the past 3 years, I had carefully studied Damien's business model, analyzed his market potential, and strategically invested in his company at crucial moments. When he needed seed funding to hire his first 10 employees, Aurora Investments had appeared. When he needed Series A funding to develop his proprietary software, Aurora Investments had come through. When he needed Series B funding to expand internationally, Aurora Investments had been there with exactly the right amount, at exactly the right time. Every single major milestone in Pinnacle Digital Solutions' success had been funded by his too stupid mother. I had done it all through shell companies, carefully structured legal entities, and a team of lawyers and accountants who maintained my anonymity. Damien thought he was a self-made entrepreneur who had impressed sophisticated investors with his brilliant vision. In reality, he was a moderately talented young man whose mother had been quietly orchestrating his success from behind the scenes. And now, as I sat in my kitchen staring at the investment documents, I realized something that made my hands shake with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. My own son was so ashamed of me, so convinced of my inadequacy, that he couldn't even imagine I might have something valuable to contribute to his world. The boy I had raised, the child I had sent to Stanford Business School with money from my North Star stock options, the young man whose rent I had secretly paid during his first startup's lean months, had just publicly humiliated me in front of his business partners and investors. He had looked me in the eye and called me too stupid to understand his work that I had literally funded. Tomorrow, Damien would receive a call from Aurora Investments lawyers. Tomorrow, he would learn that his mysterious benefactor wanted to exercise the buyback clauses in all investment agreements. Tomorrow, he would discover that $47 million, nearly 60% of his company's total funding, was being withdrawn, effective immediately. But tonight, I poured myself a glass of wine and began planning exactly how I was going to reveal the truth to my brilliant, self-made son, who was too smart to realize that his biggest investor had been sitting right at his dinner table every Sunday for the past 3 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For 3 years, I had been planning this moment, the day I would finally reveal to Damien that his mysterious angel investor was his own mother. I had it all mapped out. The perfect surprise that would transform our relationship forever and show him that the woman he'd been taking to Sunday brunch was actually his most valuable business partner. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Today was supposed to be the day of Pinnacle Digital Solutions' biggest triumph, the signing of the Takeshi Yamamoto deal, a $20 million partnership that would expand Damien's AI software into the Asian market. I had been quietly orchestrating this opportunity for months, using my connections from my North Star days to arrange introductions through back channels. Damien had no idea that his lucky break in landing this meeting had actually been his mother pulling strings behind the scenes. I had prepared everything meticulously. In my home office, the room Damien thought I used for online shopping and playing solitaire, I had spent weeks crafting the perfect presentation. Financial projections showing how Aurora Investments had strategically supported Pinnacle at every crucial growth phase. Market analysis demonstrating my deep understanding of the tech sector. Documentation proving that every major business decision Damien thought he'd made independently had actually been guided by my careful influence. The centerpiece was a custom leather portfolio embossed with the Aurora Investments logo. Inside, I had placed 3 items that would change everything: the original incorporation documents for Aurora Investments LLC, showing Evelyn Hartwell as the sole proprietor, a complete breakdown of all investments made in Pinnacle Digital Solutions, totaling $47.3 million across 17 different funding rounds, and a handwritten letter explaining my motivation, not to control his company, but to support the son I believed in when no one else would take the risk. My plan had been to arrive at the Meridian Tower at exactly 2:30 p.m., halfway through his presentation to the Japanese investors. I would ask the receptionist to send a message to the conference room. Aurora Investments representative has arrived for the meeting. Damien would be confused at first. Aurora Investments had never requested to attend investor meetings before, but he'd have no choice but to invite his mysterious benefactor to join them. I imagined walking into that glass conference room in my navy blazer, placing the leather portfolio on the table, and watching Damien's face as recognition slowly dawned. The Japanese investors would be impressed by the presence of Aurora Investments. They'd done their due diligence and knew that this mysterious firm had been Pinnacle's most consistent and largest supporter. Cassandra would finally have to acknowledge that she'd been working alongside financial genius without realizing it. "Gentlemen," I had planned to say, "I think it's time you met the real architect behind Pinnacle Digital Solutions' success." The revelation would have been perfect. Damien would finally understand that his biggest supporter hadn't been some faceless venture capital firm, but the woman who had believed in his vision before anyone else even knew it existed. He'd realize that every Sunday dinner where I asked innocent questions about his business had actually been strategy sessions where I was gathering intelligence to make better investment decisions. He'd see that his success wasn't just his own. It was a collaboration between a brilliant young entrepreneur and his equally brilliant mother. More than that, I had planned to announce my next surprise. Aurora Investments was prepared to double down on Damien's company. I had another $25 million ready to deploy, contingent on the successful completion of the Japanese deal. This would have given Pinnacle the resources to expand into European markets, hire the additional engineering talent Damien had been dreaming about, and establish the kind of international presence that would make his company a serious player in the AI industry. I had even prepared a speech for the moment after the revelation, when we were alone. I would tell him how proud I was, not just of his business acumen, but of his integrity, his work ethic, and his vision for using technology to solve real-world problems. I would explain that every investment Aurora Investments had made was based on rigorous analysis of his company's potential, not maternal favoritism. He had earned every penny through merit, innovation, and smart business decisions. The plan would have culminated in the two of us working together openly for the first time. Evelyn Hartwell, seasoned financial strategist, partnering with Damien Hartwell, innovative tech entrepreneur. We would have been unstoppable. His creative vision combined with my decades of experience navigating complex financial markets and international business relationships. I had fantasized about the follow-up conversations we'd have. Finally, I could share the insights I'd developed about his industry without having to pretend I was just making small talk. I could introduce him to contacts from my North Star network who could accelerate his growth in ways he'd never imagined. We could strategize together about market positioning, competitive analysis, and long-term growth trajectories. But most importantly, Damien would finally see me as I really was. Not just his mother, not just the retired woman who lived quietly in Millbrook Heights, but a formidable business mind who had chosen to use her expertise to launch his dreams into reality. The timing had been perfect. The Japanese investors were serious about the deal. I knew this because I had spent considerable effort researching Takeshi Yamamoto Corporation's expansion goals and confirming that Pinnacle's software aligned perfectly with their strategic objectives. This was going to be Damien's breakthrough moment, and I was going to be there to share it with him. Instead, I had been dismissed like an embarrassing relative who didn't understand that grown-ups were talking. Now, sitting in my kitchen with investment documents spread across the table, I realized how naive my plan had been. I had assumed that Damien would be thrilled to discover his mother's hidden expertise. I had believed that our relationship was strong enough to withstand the revelation that I had been secretly orchestrating his success. I had thought he would appreciate learning that his biggest supporter had been with him all along. What I hadn't anticipated was that my own son would be so ashamed of me, so convinced of my inadequacy, that he couldn't even imagine I might have valuable insights to offer. The plan I had spent 3 years developing, the perfect surprise that was supposed to bring us closer together, had crumbled before it even began. But now I had a different plan, and this one wasn't about bringing us together. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came 3 days after the humiliation at Meridian Tower, when I received an unexpected phone call from my longtime friend and former colleague, Patricia Elmsworth. Patricia had been North Star Enterprises' Vice President of Strategic Partnerships when I was CFO, and she'd maintained extensive connections throughout the tech industry even after her retirement. "Evelyn," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern I remembered from our corporate days, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Are you involved with a company called Pinnacle Digital Solutions?" My heart skipped a beat. Patricia was one of the few people who knew about my post-retirement investment activities, though she had no idea about the Aurora Investments connection to Damien. We had occasionally discussed market opportunities over our monthly lunches at the Riverside Country Club, and she'd been impressed by my knack for identifying promising startups before they became hot properties. "Why do you ask?" I said carefully, settling into my favorite chair by the window overlooking my garden. "Because I just got off the phone with Hiroshi Takeshi," she replied. "You remember him, don't you? We worked with his father's company on the North Star Asia expansion back in '09. I did remember. Hiroshi had been a junior executive then, but he'd impressed everyone with his strategic thinking and cultural intelligence. His family's corporation, Takeshi Yamamoto, had grown substantially since then, becoming a major player in the Asian technology market. "What did he tell you?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. Patricia sighed. "He said something very strange happened during their recent trip to Riverside City. They were meeting with this AI company, Pinnacle Digital Solutions, about a potential partnership. Apparently, the CEO's mother showed up uninvited and tried to insert herself into their business meeting." My stomach clenched. Even 3 days later, the memory of that moment burned with fresh humiliation. "Hiroshi said the whole situation was incredibly awkward," Patricia continued. "The mother seemed convinced she could contribute to their discussion about international market expansion and financial modeling. The CEO and his business partner had to basically escort her out of the building. Hiroshi was asking me if American business culture had changed dramatically since we worked together, because he couldn't understand how a senior executive would allow family members to interfere with professional meetings." The words hit me like physical blows. Not only had Damien humiliated me in front of his colleagues, but the story had somehow made its way back to the very investors he'd been trying to impress. The Japanese business community was notoriously small and interconnected. If Hiroshi Takeshi was talking about this incident, it would spread quickly among other potential partners and investors. "The really odd part," Patricia went on, "is that Hiroshi said the company seemed promising otherwise. Good technology, solid business model, impressive growth trajectory. But he's concerned about the leadership's judgment and professionalism. He specifically mentioned that any CEO who can't maintain appropriate boundaries with family members might not be ready for the kind of high-stakes international partnerships they're looking for." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. My attempt to support Damien had not only resulted in my own humiliation, it was actively damaging his business prospects. "Evelyn," Patricia said gently, "I know you've been interested in the tech sector lately. If you're connected to this situation somehow, you might want to know that Takeshi Yamamoto is reconsidering the deal. They're not walking away entirely, but they're definitely proceeding with more caution." After I hung up, I sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour. The full implications of what had happened were becoming clear, and they were far worse than I'd initially realized. My presence at that meeting hadn't just been an embarrassing moment for Damien. It had potentially cost him a $20 million partnership. But as the shock wore off, a different emotion began to take its place. Anger. Not at myself for trying to attend the meeting, but at Damien for his handling of the situation. A truly skilled executive would have found a way to manage the unexpected appearance of a family member without creating the kind of scene that international business partners would gossip about. Instead, his panic and embarrassment had turned what could have been a minor awkwardness into a professional disaster. More troubling was what this revealed about Damien's character. Even if he genuinely believed I lacked the expertise to contribute to the meeting, a decent human being would have found a kinder way to handle the situation. He could have introduced me to his colleagues, allowed me to observe for a few minutes, and then suggested we continue our conversation later. Instead, he'd chosen public humiliation as his preferred method of dealing with his inconvenient mother. The second warning sign came the following day, when I made my regular weekly check on Aurora Investments' portfolio through my secure online portal. As the company's anonymous benefactor, I received detailed monthly reports on Pinnacle's financial performance, but I also monitored several key metrics in real time to ensure my investments remained sound. What I found made my blood run cold. Damien had made several significant financial decisions in the past 72 hours without consulting Aurora Investments, despite contractual agreements requiring approval for any expenditures over $100,000. He had authorized a $250,000 marketing campaign with a prestigious San Francisco advertising agency. He had authorized $180,000 in new equipment purchases for the engineering department. Most concerning of all, he had signed a 6-month lease on additional office space in the Meridian Tower's executive floors, committing the company to $75,000 per month in additional overhead. These weren't necessarily bad business decisions, but they represented a troubling pattern. Damien was spending money aggressively, apparently confident that Aurora Investments would continue providing funding regardless of his company's decision-making process. He was acting like someone who believed his mysterious benefactor would always be there to cover his expenses, no matter how he chose to run his business. I pulled up the communication logs between Aurora Investments and Pinnacle Digital Solutions. Over the past 3 years, my legal representatives had sent dozens of strategic recommendations, financial guidance memos, and market analysis reports to help guide the company's growth. I had assumed Damien was taking this advice seriously, using Aurora's insights to make better business decisions. But as I reviewed the correspondence more carefully, I realized something disturbing. Damien had been largely ignoring Aurora Investments' guidance for months. The marketing campaign he'd just approved was in direct contradiction to a detailed memo my team had sent 2 weeks earlier, recommending a more conservative approach to customer acquisition until the Japanese partnership was finalized. The office expansion violated explicit advice to maintain lean overhead until revenue growth could support increased fixed costs. It was as if Damien viewed Aurora Investments not as a strategic partner but as an endless source of funding with no real authority over how the money was used. He was treating his biggest investor with the same dismissive attitude he'd shown his mother at the Meridian Tower, politely acknowledging their existence while completely disregarding their input. The third warning sign was the most personal, and it came during our usual Sunday dinner at my house in Millbrook Heights. Damien arrived 45 minutes late, his hair disheveled and his expensive shirt wrinkled. He'd clearly come directly from the office, and he seemed distracted throughout our meal. "How are things going with the Japanese investors?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I served his favorite dessert. Apple pie made from scratch with apples from my own garden. "Oh, that," he said dismissively, barely looking up from his phone. "Yeah, that deal's probably not going to happen. Turns out they're not as serious as we thought. These international companies, they waste everybody's time with meetings and presentations, but when it comes to actually writing checks, they get cold feet." I nearly choked on my coffee. "What do you mean it's not going to happen? I thought the partnership was exactly what Pinnacle needed to expand internationally." Damien shrugged. still scrolling through his messages. Well, that was the plan, but these investors are being ridiculous. They're asking all these detailed questions about our governance structure and leadership stability. It's like they want to micromanage every aspect of our business before they'll commit to anything. Maybe they're just being careful, I suggested. $20 million is a significant investment. They probably want to make sure they're partnering with a company that shares their values and business practices. Mom, Damien said with that familiar tone of patient condescension, you don't understand how these deals work. Investors who ask too many questions are usually looking for excuses to back out. Real partners trust your expertise and let you run your business the way you know best. As I watched my son dismiss one of the most important opportunities in his company's history with such casual arrogance, I realized that everything I thought I knew about him might be wrong. The young man sitting at my dining table wasn't the thoughtful, strategic entrepreneur I'd been supporting through Aurora Investments. He was someone who blamed others for his failures, ignored valuable advice from his biggest investor, and believed that success should come without accountability. The warnings were all there, glaring and obvious. I just hadn't wanted to see them. The devastating truth came to me through a series of text messages that I was never supposed to see. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after my humiliation at the Meridian Tower, when my phone buzzed with what appeared to be a group message intended for someone else entirely. The first message came from Cassandra Vale. Did you see the latest Aurora Investments quarterly report? They're asking for detailed explanations on all our recent expenditures. Damien's spending like we have unlimited funding. I stared at my phone in confusion. Why was I receiving messages about Aurora Investments? Then I realized what had happened. Someone had accidentally added my number to what was clearly meant to be a private business discussion. My son's business partner was texting about my own investment company, completely unaware that she was messaging the very person she was discussing. The next message came from someone named Trevor Blackstone, a name I didn't recognize. Aurora's been way too hands-off until now. Most VCs would have demanded board seats for this level of investment. Either they're complete amateurs or they're planning something big. Then Cassandra again. Damien thinks they're pushovers. He's been treating their recommendations like suggestions instead of requirements. I keep telling him we need to take them more seriously, but he's convinced they'll keep funding us no matter what we do. My hands started trembling as I read the messages. This was a group chat between Damien's inner circle, and they were discussing Aurora Investments, discussing me, with a casual contempt that made my stomach turn. Trevor responded, "What does Damien actually know about Aurora anyway? Have you guys ever met them face to face? Seems weird that they've invested almost $50 million without wanting more direct involvement." "That's what I keep saying," Cassandra typed. "But Damien's not worried. He thinks we've got them wrapped around our finger. Quote unquote, they're so desperate to be part of our success that they'll fund whatever we need without asking hard questions." I had to set my phone down and take several deep breaths. The casual arrogance in that statement was breathtaking. Damien actually believed that Aurora Investments was desperate to fund his company. He had no idea that every dollar he'd received had been carefully calculated, that every investment decision had been based on rigorous analysis of his company's potential and strategic value. The messages continued to pour in, each one revealing more about how my son really viewed his mysterious benefactor. "The latest is hilarious," Trevor wrote. "Damien got some formal notice from Aurora's lawyers about the unauthorized office lease. Instead of being concerned, he's actually annoyed. Says, quote, what kind of investor micromanages office space decisions? If they don't trust us to make basic operational choices, maybe we should look for better partners." My vision actually blurred with rage. That formal notice had been my attempt to provide gentle guidance about fiscal responsibility. I had spent hours crafting careful language that would help Damien understand the importance of managing overhead costs without overstepping my bounds as an investor, and he had dismissed it as micromanagement. Cassandra's next message made everything worse. Speaking of better partners, I've been quietly reaching out to some contacts at Meridian Capital. They've expressed serious interest in leading a Series C round, much more money than Aurora, and they actually understand that successful entrepreneurs need freedom to operate. Smart move, Trevor replied, especially after that embarrassing thing with Damien's mom last week. Meridian's partners are all sophisticated business people. They'd never have family members showing up to important meetings asking to, quote, learn about the tech industry. There it was. They were all laughing about my humiliation, using it as evidence that Damien needed more sophisticated investors. The irony was so crushing, it was almost funny. They wanted to replace Aurora Investments with a more professional firm, completely unaware that Aurora's founder had more corporate experience than all of them combined. But the messages weren't finished destroying me yet. Honestly, Cassandra continued, I think Damien's getting a little too comfortable with Aurora's money. He's spending like we're already profitable instead of burning through someone else's investment. Did you see he authorized another $250,000 for that marketing campaign extension? Yeah, I saw that, Trevor responded. When I asked him about it, he said, and I quote, Aurora will cover it. They always do. They're basically a free ATM at this point. I actually gasped out loud reading that. A free ATM. That's how my son viewed the $47 million I had invested in his dream. 3 years of strategic support, careful guidance, and financial backing, and he saw me as nothing more than an endless source of money with no expectations or intelligence behind it. The final series of messages came rapid fire, as if the group had moved from casual gossip to serious strategic planning. Cassandra, I say we take the Meridian deal and use it to buy out Aurora completely. Clean slate with professional investors who understand the tech industry. Trevor, agreed. Aurora's money was useful when we were desperate, but we've outgrown them. Time to work with real players. Unknown number, probably another team member. What about the contractual obligations to Aurora? Don't they have some kind of buyback protection? Cassandra, legal says the contracts are pretty standard. We'd have to pay back the principal plus a reasonable return, but nothing crazy. And honestly, getting rid of an investor who doesn't understand our business model would be worth it. Trevor, plus imagine how impressed the Meridian partners will be when they see we're decisive enough to upgrade our investor base, shows real leadership. I sat in my kitchen, staring at these messages, feeling like I was watching my son plan to steal from me while mocking my intelligence. Not only was he spending my money carelessly and ignoring my advice, but he was actively plotting to push me out of the company I had built with him. And the worst part was his casual assumption that Aurora Investments, that I, was too unsophisticated to understand what was happening. The group chat continued for another 20 minutes, with various team members chiming in to support the plan to replace Aurora Investments with Meridian Capital. They discussed timeline, legal strategies, and even celebration plans for when they finally freed themselves from their amateur investor. Through it all, not one person expressed any gratitude for the support Aurora had provided during Pinnacle's crucial early stages. No one acknowledged that without Aurora's initial investment, there would be no company for Meridian Capital to be interested in. They talked about me like I was an obstacle to overcome, not the foundation they had built their success upon. But the most devastating revelation came in Cassandra's final message of the conversation. You know what the really crazy part is? Damien's mom keeps asking about the business at their family dinners. Like she thinks she could actually contribute something useful. Can you imagine if she knew how much money we're working with? She'd probably want to give us investment advice. Trevor's response was immediate. LOL. Hey, Mom. Should we diversify our revenue streams? I don't know, honey. What does your horoscope say? The entire group erupted in laughing emojis and joke responses about what kind of business advice I might offer. They were literally mocking the idea that I could have anything valuable to say about their industry, completely oblivious to the fact that I had been their most important strategic advisor all along. As I finally turned off my phone, my hands were shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak that I had never experienced before. My son didn't just disrespect me as his mother. He was actively plotting to steal from me as his investor while mocking my intelligence to his colleagues. The boy I had raised, the young man I had believed in when no one else would take the risk, was planning to betray me in the most fundamental way possible. And he was so confident in my stupidity that he didn't even think I was capable of discovering his plan. That was the moment I realized that everything I thought I knew about Damien was a lie, and it was time for him to learn exactly who he had been stealing from. Over the next 48 hours, I conducted the most thorough investigation of my own investment that I had ever undertaken. What I discovered was so much worse than a group chat full of casual disrespect and betrayal. It was a systematic pattern of deception, financial irresponsibility, and outright fraud that had been happening right under my nose for months. Using my access to Aurora Investments' comprehensive monitoring systems, I began digging deep into every transaction, every decision, and every communication that had occurred between my company and Pinnacle Digital Solutions over the past year. What emerged was a picture of my son that I barely recognized, and a business operation that was fundamentally different from what I had believed I was supporting. The financial irregularities were staggering. That unauthorized $250,000 marketing campaign that Cassandra had mentioned, it wasn't just an impulse decision. When I traced the payments, I discovered that $75,000 of that money had been funneled to a secondary company called Hartwell Consulting Group, a business entity that Damien had created without disclosure and was using to pay himself consulting fees on top of his regular salary. Essentially, my son was using Aurora's investment money to give himself a raise while hiding it from his own investor. But that was just the beginning. The new office lease in Meridian Tower's executive floors wasn't the prudent expansion I had assumed. Through property records and lease agreements that Aurora's legal team could access, I learned that Damien had signed a 5-year deal for 8,000 square feet of premium office space, enough room for a company 3 times Pinnacle's current size. The monthly rent of $75,000 was supplemented by another $25,000 in executive amenities, including a private chef, premium coffee service, and a fully stocked bar. My son was using my money to live like a tech mogul, while his company was still fighting for market share. Even more disturbing was what I found when I examined the staffing decisions from the past 6 months. Damien had hired his college roommate Trevor Blackstone as Director of Strategic Initiatives at a salary of $180,000 per year, despite the fact that Trevor's only professional experience was selling insurance for his father's agency in Ohio. His girlfriend, a yoga instructor named Amber Delacroix, had been brought on as wellness coordinator for $95,000 annually, supposedly to improve employee mental health and productivity. Most offensive of all, Cassandra Vale had received a promotion to Chief Operating Officer with a salary increase that brought her compensation to $275,000, more than most CEOs of companies Pinnacle's size. But the personnel issues went beyond simple nepotism. When I cross-referenced the employee roster with actual productivity metrics, I discovered that Pinnacle's core engineering team, the people actually building the AI software that was supposed to be revolutionizing the industry, had been working with outdated equipment and insufficient resources, while Damien spent lavishly on management salaries and office luxuries. The 12 engineers responsible for Pinnacle's primary product were sharing 3 servers that should have been upgraded months ago, while the executive floor featured a $45,000 conference table and a $30,000 cappuccino machine. The marketing campaign that had consumed so much of Aurora's recent investment was equally revealing. Instead of the data-driven customer acquisition strategy that Aurora's consultants had recommended, Damien had hired a San Francisco agency called Prestige Digital to create what they described as a quote, 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 quote. The campaign centered around a series of glossy videos featuring Damien himself, as the face of Pinnacle Digital Solutions, shot in expensive locations around Riverside City, and designed to position him as a visionary tech leader rather than focus on the actual software capabilities. When I watched these promotional videos, I felt physically sick. My son appeared in $3,000 suits, speaking in abstract terms about disrupting traditional paradigms and, quote, leveraging synergistic technologies, while providing almost no concrete information about what Pinnacle software actually did or why customers should choose it over competitors. The entire campaign was an exercise in ego-stroking, funded by money I had invested to build a sustainable business. The technical analysis was perhaps the most damning revelation of all. Aurora Investments had hired independent software consultants to evaluate Pinnacle's core product every 6 months, and I had been receiving sanitized summaries that made the technology sound cutting-edge and competitive. But when I demanded access to the full technical reports, I learned that Pinnacle's AI software was, according to multiple experts, derivative and technically unremarkable. The consultant's detailed analysis revealed that Damien's supposedly revolutionary artificial intelligence platform was essentially a collection of existing open-source algorithms packaged with a prettier user interface. The core functionality could be replicated by any competent development team in less than 3 months. There were at least 8 direct competitors offering superior products at lower prices, and several major tech companies were developing solutions that would make Pinnacle's entire approach obsolete within 2 years. Most crushing of all was the discovery that the Japanese partnership with Takeshi Yamamoto Corporation had never been as solid as I believed. When I used my connections to contact Hiroshi Takeshi directly, I learned that his company had been interested in Pinnacle not because of its innovative technology, but because they were looking for a small American firm they could acquire cheaply and use as a foothold in the U.S. market. The $20 million partnership I thought would catapult Damien to success was actually a buyout offer that would have given him a modest payout while transferring all intellectual property rights to Japan. Damien had either completely misunderstood the nature of the deal, or he had been deliberately misrepresenting it to make his company seem more valuable than it actually was. Either way, my son had been on the verge of selling his entire business to foreign investors while using my money to fund an unsustainable lifestyle and pay inflated salaries to his friends. But the most personal betrayal came when I discovered the conversations Damien had been having with other potential investors. Through Aurora's legal team, I obtained copies of communications between Pinnacle and Meridian Capital, the firm that Cassandra had mentioned in the group chat. The discussions had been going on for over 2 months, and Damien had been systematically lying about Aurora Investments in order to make his company more attractive to new partners. In his presentations to Meridian, Damien described Aurora as a small regional fund with limited tech industry experience that had served its purpose during our early growth phase, but lacks the sophistication for our next stage of development. He claimed that Aurora's investment had come with restrictive covenants and micromanagement issues that were hampering Pinnacle's ability to scale rapidly. Most infuriatingly, he suggested that replacing Aurora with Meridian would be, quote, a strategic upgrade that demonstrates our commitment to working with institutional-grade partners. Every single statement was not just false, but the exact opposite of reality. Aurora Investments had consistently provided guidance that was more sophisticated and strategic than anything Meridian's cookie-cutter approach could offer. The restrictive covenants Damien complained about were standard investor protections designed to ensure responsible use of capital. And the micromanagement he described was actually a hands-off approach that had given him far more autonomy than most entrepreneurs ever receive from their major investors. The final piece of evidence that completed my understanding of Damien's betrayal was a recorded phone call between him and Meridian's managing partner, obtained through Aurora's legal right to monitor communications that could affect our investment. In this conversation, Damien explicitly stated that he viewed Aurora as family money that had been easy to access but came with emotional complications. "The thing about taking money from people who don't really understand your business," he said with casual contempt, is that they tend to think their investment gives them the right to offer opinions about everything. Aurora's been great for funding, but they've never really grasped the technical complexity of what we're building here. We need partners who can add strategic value beyond just writing checks. Hearing my son describe 3 years of careful strategic guidance as emotional complications and dismiss my decades of business experience as insufficient understanding felt like being stabbed in the heart. But what came next was even worse. Plus, Damien continued, I'm pretty confident we can structure the Aurora buyout in a way that saves us a significant amount of money. They invested early when we were desperate, so they accepted pretty standard terms. Nothing like the premium valuation we'll get from a sophisticated fund like Meridian. He was planning to cheat me out of the full value of my investment by exploiting the generous terms I had offered when his company was struggling. The family money that had saved his business when no one else would take the risk was going to be repaid at a fraction of its current worth, and he was laughing about his cleverness in structuring it that way. As I sat in my home office, surrounded by 3 years' worth of financial documents and strategic reports, I realized that I had been funding not just a business, but a complete fantasy. My son had used my money to create an elaborate illusion of success while systematically planning to betray the person who had made it all possible. And the most devastating part was his absolute certainty that I would never be smart enough to figure out what he was doing. Sitting in my home office, surrounded by evidence of my son's betrayal, I found myself transported back to the beginning, to the moment 28 years ago when I first walked into the gleaming headquarters of North Star Enterprises as a newly hired junior financial analyst. Back then, I was Evelyn Morrison, a 26-year-old woman with an MBA from Columbia and enough determination to power a small city, but no connections, no family money, and no understanding of just how brutal the corporate world could be for someone like me. North Star Enterprises was already a tech giant in the early days of personal computing, but it was also an unforgiving boys' club where women were tolerated in administrative roles and quietly pushed out of anything involving real power. My first supervisor, a condescending middle manager named Richard Pemberton, assigned me to reconciling expense reports and updating spreadsheets that no one would ever read. When I suggested process improvements that could save the company hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, he patted my shoulder and told me to, quote, focus on mastering the basics before trying to reinvent the wheel. But I wasn't willing to accept a lifetime of reconciling other people's lunch receipts. During my off hours, I began studying North Star's financial structure with the same intensity that medical students memorize anatomy. I learned every subsidiary, every partnership agreement, every revenue stream, and every hidden cost center. I discovered inefficiencies that senior executives didn't even know existed, and I started documenting solutions that could transform the company's profitability. The breakthrough came during my second year, when North Star was struggling with a potential acquisition that could either catapult the company into international markets or destroy its balance sheet entirely. The target was a French software company called Lumiere Technologies, and the negotiations had been stalled for months because no one at North Star could accurately assess the value of Lumiere's intellectual property portfolio. I had been teaching myself French using library books and audio tapes, partly because I'd always loved languages and partly because I believed that understanding global markets would be essential for any serious business career. When I overheard executives complaining about the language barriers and cultural misunderstandings that were complicating the Lumiere deal, I saw my opportunity. Working nights and weekends, I translated every document in Lumiere's patent filings, analyzed their research and development pipeline, and created a comprehensive valuation model that took into account not just their current products, but their potential for innovation in emerging markets. My analysis revealed that Lumiere was worth nearly twice what North Star's executives had estimated, but also that their most valuable assets were being completely overlooked in the acquisition discussions. When I finally gathered the courage to present my findings to Richard Pemberton, he laughed in my face. "Evelyn," he said with the kind of smile that makes your skin crawl, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but international acquisitions are handled by people with decades of experience. Why don't you stick to what you know and leave the strategic thinking to the professionals? So I went over his head. And when the department director dismissed me with similar condescension, I went over his head too. Eventually, my analysis landed on the desk of North Star's CEO, Harrison Blackthorne, a brilliant and ruthless man who cared more about results than corporate hierarchy. Blackthorne called me into his office on a Friday afternoon, and I expected to be fired for circumventing the chain of command. Instead, he asked me to explain my analysis of the Lumiere deal. For 2 hours, I walked him through every detail of my research, answered every challenging question he posed, and defended my conclusions with the kind of precision that comes from months of obsessive preparation. When I finished, Blackthorne leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Miss Morrison," he said, "how would you like to lead the Lumiere acquisition personally?" 6 months later, I had negotiated the most successful international acquisition in North Star's history. Lumiere Technologies became the foundation of North Star's European operations, generating over $200 million in revenue within 3 years. My French language skills, combined with my financial analysis and cultural sensitivity, had unlocked opportunities that North Star's existing team never could have accessed. But more importantly, the success of the Lumiere deal taught me something that would shape the rest of my career. The most valuable skill in business isn't technical expertise or financial modeling, it's the ability to see potential that others miss. While everyone else was focused on Lumiere's current products and immediate revenue, I had recognized their capacity for innovation and growth in markets that didn't even exist yet. That philosophy guided every decision I made during my climb through North Star's executive ranks. While other executives competed for the most prestigious divisions and highest-profile projects, I sought out the opportunities that seemed impossible or unprofitable to conventional thinking. I specialized in turning around failing subsidiaries, identifying undervalued acquisition targets, and developing new revenue streams in emerging markets. By the time I was 35, I had been promoted to Chief Financial Officer, making me the youngest person and the first woman to hold that position in North Star's history. But the title was just the beginning. Over the next decade, I transformed how North Star approached international expansion, strategic partnerships, and long-term planning. I developed relationships with technology leaders across Europe and Asia, created financial models that predicted market trends years before they became obvious to competitors, and built the systems that would sustain North Star's growth for decades to come. The pinnacle of my career came when I orchestrated North Star's expansion into the Asian market, a move that most analysts considered impossibly risky. American tech companies had been trying to crack the Asian market for years, but cultural differences and regulatory complexities had defeated even the most sophisticated corporations. I spent 3 years building relationships with key partners, learning about local business practices, and developing strategies that respected Asian approaches to technology and commerce. The result was a joint venture with 3 Asian technology firms that generated over $500 million in its first year and established North Star as the dominant Western technology company in markets from Tokyo to Singapore. The success of this expansion doubled North Star's market capitalization and made me one of the most influential women in the global tech industry. But perhaps the most important lesson I learned during those years was about the nature of power and respect. When I started at North Star, people dismissed my ideas because I was young and female and lacked the proper connections. As I climbed the corporate ladder, those same people began treating me with deference and seeking my advice, not because I had fundamentally changed as a person, but because I had proven my value in terms they couldn't ignore. The transformation was both gratifying and deeply cynical. The insights I had been offering as a junior analyst were no different from the strategies I proposed as CFO, but suddenly everyone wanted to hear them. Richard Pemberton, the supervisor who had told me to stick to expense reports, became one of my most enthusiastic supporters, constantly reminding people that he had always known I had exceptional potential. That experience taught me that respect in the business world isn't earned through intelligence or integrity, it's commanded through results. People will ignore the most brilliant ideas if they come from someone they perceive as powerless, and they'll applaud mediocre suggestions from someone they view as successful. The key to real influence isn't being right, it's being right in a way that forces others to acknowledge your value. When I finally retired from North Star at 58, I walked away with a reputation as one of the most successful executives in the technology industry, a network of international business contacts that spanned 6 continents, and a personal fortune that gave me complete financial independence. But more than any of that, I had learned how to identify potential in places where others saw only risk or failure. That's why I had been so confident in my investment in Damien's company. I thought I was seeing the same kind of overlooked potential in Pinnacle Digital Solutions that I had recognized in Lumiere Technologies all those years ago. I believe that my son had inherited not just my intelligence and determination, but my ability to innovate in ways that conventional thinkers couldn't appreciate. What I had failed to consider was that Damien had also inherited something else from his family: the capacity for deception and betrayal that I knew all too well from his father. But that was a different story, one that explained not just how I had built my fortune, but why I had been so desperate to believe that my son was different from the man who had broken my heart and nearly destroyed my faith in human nature. The irony was devastating. I had spent decades proving that others consistently underestimated my intelligence and capabilities. Now I discovered that I had been just as blind when it came to the person I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world. The pain of Damien's betrayal wasn't just about the money or the business deception, it was about the devastating repetition of a pattern I thought I had escaped forever. As I sat surrounded by evidence of my son's fraud, memories I had spent decades suppressing came flooding back with brutal clarity. The story of how I had built my fortune was inextricably linked to the story of how I had lost everything that mattered most, and why I had been so desperate to believe that Damien was different from his father. Robert Hartwell had been everything I thought I wanted when I met him during my early years at North Star. He was a successful attorney specializing in corporate mergers, 6 years older than me, devastatingly handsome and seemingly fascinated by my rapid rise through the company's executive ranks. While my male colleagues treated my success with barely concealed resentment, Robert appeared genuinely impressed by my intelligence and ambition. He was the first man who seemed to see my career achievements as attractive rather than threatening. We met at a corporate networking event in downtown Riverside City, and I was immediately drawn to his confidence and sophistication. He drove a black BMW, wore suits that cost more than my monthly salary, and spoke fluent German and Italian from his years studying international law in Europe. When he asked me to dinner at the most expensive restaurant in the city, I felt like I had finally found someone who belonged in the successful life I was building for myself. The courtship was everything a young executive could dream of. Robert sent flowers to my office, took me to exclusive social events where I met judges and politicians and other successful attorneys, and treated me like I was the most fascinating woman he had ever encountered. He listened intently when I talked about my work, asked intelligent questions about my investment strategies, and even helped me research the legal implications of some of North Star's more complex international deals. When he proposed after 8 months of dating, presenting me with a 3-carat diamond ring at the top of the Riverside Tower during a private dinner he had arranged with the building's management company, I felt like my life was perfectly complete. I was 29 years old, recently promoted to senior financial analyst, engaged to a brilliant and successful man who supported my career, and absolutely certain that I had found my ideal partner. We married in a lavish ceremony at the Riverside Country Club, with 400 guests including half of North Star's executive team and most of the city's legal and business establishment. My wedding dress cost $8,000, the reception featured a live orchestra, and we honeymooned for 3 weeks in Europe, visiting Robert's former colleagues and exploring the art museums and historical sites I had always dreamed of seeing. For the first 2 years of our marriage, everything seemed perfect. Robert's law practice was thriving, my career at North Star was accelerating rapidly, and we were building the kind of life that appeared in magazine spreads about successful young couples. We bought a beautiful home in Millbrook Heights, entertained regularly, and began talking about starting a family once I achieved my goal of becoming North Star's youngest ever vice president. But success, I learned, can be as dangerous as failure when it comes to revealing people's true nature. The first crack in our perfect facade appeared when I was promoted to Director of International Development, a position that came with a salary increase that brought my income to within $10,000 of Robert's annual earnings. Instead of celebrating my achievement, he became strangely quiet and distant. When I excitedly told him about the promotion over dinner at our favorite restaurant, he smiled and congratulated me, but I could see something cold and calculating in his eyes that I had never noticed before. "That's wonderful, darling," he said, raising his wine glass in a toast. "I'm sure the additional responsibilities won't interfere too much with your other priorities." I didn't understand what he meant by other priorities until several months later, when I discovered that Robert had been systematically sabotaging my career advancement while pretending to support it. The discovery came accidentally, during a dinner party we hosted for several of Robert's law partners and their wives. I was in the kitchen preparing dessert when I overheard a conversation from the dining room that made my blood run cold. "You've done an impressive job managing the situation," one of the partners was saying to Robert. "Most men wouldn't be comfortable with a wife who earns more than they do, but you found creative ways to maintain the proper balance." "It's all about subtle guidance," Robert replied with a chuckle. "Evelyn's very ambitious, but she's also very trusting. A few strategically placed concerns about work-life balance, some gentle suggestions about the importance of being available for family obligations, and she naturally starts making choices that prioritize our relationship over her career." "Brilliant," another voice chimed in. "My wife went through a similar phase when the children were young, wanting to prove herself in some corporate environment. But a smart husband knows how to redirect that energy toward more appropriate channels." I stood frozen in my kitchen, holding a serving tray, as my husband and his colleagues discussed me like I was a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be supported. But the conversation wasn't finished destroying me yet. "The key," Robert continued, "is making sure she feels like she's making her own decisions. When she was up for that vice president position last year, I didn't forbid her from pursuing it. I just mentioned how much time she'd have to spend traveling, how it might affect our ability to start a family, and how important it was for us to be able to spend quality time together. She withdrew her name from consideration all on her own. The vice president position. The opportunity I had worked toward for 3 years. The promotion that would have established me as one of the youngest senior executives in North Star's history. I had convinced myself that I wasn't ready for that level of responsibility, that I wanted to focus on strengthening my marriage before taking on additional professional demands. But Robert had manipulated me into abandoning my dreams while making me believe it was my own choice. "And now?" one of the partners asked. "Now she's pregnant," Robert said with satisfaction. "Nothing redirects a woman's ambitions quite like motherhood. She'll probably take extended maternity leave, maybe go part-time for a few years. By the time she's ready to refocus on her career, she'll be years behind her peers, and the opportunities won't be there anymore." Pregnant? I wasn't pregnant. Robert and I had been trying to start a family for months, but so far without success. Unless... I quietly set down the serving tray and walked to my purse, where I kept the birth control pills I had supposedly stopped taking 3 months earlier. The prescription bottle was exactly where I had left it, but when I opened it, I discovered that someone had replaced my birth control pills with vitamin supplements. The pills were identical in size and color, but completely ineffective at preventing pregnancy. My husband had been secretly sabotaging my contraception while pretending to be disappointed by our failure to conceive. He had been lying to me about the most fundamental aspect of our family planning, while boasting to his colleagues about how cleverly he was manipulating my life choices. That night, after our guests had left and Robert had fallen asleep, I sat in my home office and tried to understand how completely I had been deceived. The man I had married, the person I trusted more than anyone else in the world, had been systematically destroying my career and controlling my reproductive choices while maintaining a facade of love and support. But the most devastating realization was how effective his manipulation had been. I had genuinely believed that I was making independent decisions about my career and family. When I withdrew from the vice president competition, I felt like I was being mature and thoughtful about work-life balance. When I agreed to start trying for children, I felt like I was embracing a new and exciting phase of our relationship. Robert had been so skilled at psychological manipulation that he had made me complicit in my own subjugation. The pregnancy test I took the next morning was positive. I was carrying the child of a man who had been lying to me about everything that mattered most, using my own hopes and dreams against me to ensure that I would never become successful enough to threaten his sense of masculine superiority. Standing in my bathroom, staring at those 2 pink lines, I faced the most difficult decision of my life. I could confront Robert and try to salvage our marriage, knowing that he viewed me as a problem to be managed, rather than a partner to be cherished. I could leave him and raise the child alone, destroying the life I had worked so hard to build. Or I could find a way to stay married while protecting myself and my unborn child from further manipulation. What I chose to do next would determine not just the course of my own life, but the kind of mother I would become and the lessons I would teach my child about trust, betrayal, and the price of giving your heart to someone who doesn't deserve it. 28 years later, as I sat in that same home office contemplating my son's betrayal, I realized that all my careful planning and protective strategies had failed in the most fundamental way possible. Despite everything I had done to raise Damien differently, despite all my efforts to teach him about integrity and respect, he had inherited his father's capacity for deception and his father's willingness to exploit the people who loved him most. The boy I had protected from Robert's influence had become exactly the kind of man I had spent decades learning to recognize and defend against. And the most painful irony was that I had funded his transformation into his father's son with money I had earned by refusing to be anyone's victim ever again. The morning after I discovered Robert's deception, I made a decision that would define the next 3 decades of my life. I would not be destroyed by his betrayal. Instead, I would use it as fuel to build something so powerful and independent that no one would ever be able to manipulate me again. What followed was the most difficult and transformative period of my existence, as I learned to navigate pregnancy, divorce, single motherhood, and corporate warfare while never allowing anyone to see how close I came to breaking under the pressure. My first move was strategic silence. I said nothing to Robert about what I had discovered, continuing to play the role of the grateful, slightly naive wife, while I quietly began documenting every aspect of his manipulation and planning my exit strategy. I used my financial expertise to analyze our joint assets, identifying which investments and properties I could claim in a divorce settlement and which legal strategies would give me the strongest position in custody negotiations. But more importantly, I threw myself into my work at North Star with an intensity that shocked even my most ambitious colleagues. If Robert thought that pregnancy would derail my career, he was about to learn exactly how wrong a very intelligent man could be when he underestimated an even more intelligent woman. The key was the Lumiere Technologies acquisition, which had been my breakthrough project but was now facing unexpected complications. The French company's founders were having second thoughts about the deal, citing concerns about cultural integration and American management practices. North Star's executives were growing frustrated with the delays, and several board members were suggesting that we abandon the acquisition entirely rather than risk further deterioration of the relationship. I saw an opportunity that no one else recognized. Using my pregnancy as cover, Robert and my colleagues all assumed I was distracted by morning sickness and baby preparations. I began working 18-hour days to develop a completely new approach to the Lumiere deal. Instead of the traditional acquisition model that Northstar had been pursuing, I proposed a joint venture structure that would preserve Lumiere's autonomy while giving Northstar access to their technology and European markets. The proposal required months of complex legal and financial analysis, negotiations with French regulatory authorities, and careful relationship building with Lumiere's leadership team. I taught myself advanced French business terminology, studied European corporate law, and even traveled to Paris twice during my second trimester to meet with potential partners and government officials. Robert was initially suspicious of my frequent business trips and late nights at the office. "Shouldn't you be focusing on preparing for the baby?" he asked with false concern. "All this stress can't be good for your health or the pregnancy." "Oh, I'm just tying up some loose ends before maternity leave," I replied sweetly. "I want to make sure everything's in good shape for my replacement." What I was actually doing was orchestrating the most complex international business deal in Northstar's history, while secretly meeting with divorce attorneys and private investigators during my lunch breaks. The breakthrough came during my third trimester, when I finally convinced Lumiere's founders that the joint venture model would allow them to maintain their company's innovative culture while accessing Northstar's resources and distribution networks. The deal I structured gave Northstar effective control of Lumiere's technology, while preserving the French team's autonomy and providing them with financial incentives that far exceeded what a traditional acquisition would have offered. When I presented the final proposal to Northstar's board of directors at 7 months pregnant, the response was unanimous approval and complete amazement at the complexity and sophistication of what I had accomplished. The joint venture would generate an estimated $300 million in revenue over its first 3 years, while positioning Northstar as the dominant American technology company in European markets. Harrison Blackthorne pulled me aside after the presentation. "Evelyn," he said, "this is the most brilliant piece of strategic thinking I've seen in 20 years of business. How did you manage to put this together while preparing for your first child?" "I suppose I work well under pressure," I replied, which was certainly true, though not in the way he imagined. 3 weeks later, Damien was born, and I discovered that motherhood was both more wonderful and more terrifying than anything I had experienced in the corporate world. Holding my son for the first time, looking into his perfect, tiny face, I felt a love so fierce and protective that it physically changed me. This child would never experience the kind of betrayal and manipulation that had nearly destroyed me. I would make sure of that, no matter what it cost. But I also knew that protecting Damien meant protecting myself first. A mother without power or resources cannot shield her child from the world's dangers, and I was determined to build enough of both to ensure that my son would never be vulnerable the way I had been. The divorce proceedings began when Damien was 6 weeks old. Robert was initially confident that he could control the outcome the same way he had controlled our marriage, but he had seriously underestimated both my preparation and my motivation. The private investigators I had hired during my pregnancy had documented his manipulation tactics, his secret meetings with colleagues about managing me, and several financial irregularities in his law practice that he definitely didn't want exposed in court proceedings. More importantly, my success with the Lumiere deal had established me as one of Northstar's most valuable executives, making it impossible for Robert to argue that I was an unfit mother due to career instability or financial dependence. When his attorneys suggested that my work schedule made me unavailable for proper child rearing, I countered with evidence of his own 70-hour workweeks and frequent business trips. The settlement I negotiated gave me primary custody of Damien, the house in Millbrook Heights, and a substantial portion of Robert's investment portfolio. But more importantly, I had proven to myself that I could outmaneuver someone who had been manipulating me for years, even while managing pregnancy, childbirth, and the early stages of motherhood. Returning to work after maternity leave, I found that my colleagues' attitudes toward me had fundamentally changed. The woman who had once been patronized and underestimated was now viewed as someone who could accomplish the impossible under the most challenging circumstances. The success of the Lumiere joint venture had generated so much revenue and positive attention that North Star's board fast-tracked my promotion to Vice President of International Development, the same position Robert had manipulated me into abandoning just 2 years earlier. But the real transformation was in how I approached relationships and trust. I had learned that even people who claimed to love me could be systematically deceiving me, and that my own intelligence and intuition were not sufficient protection against skilled manipulation. From now on, I would verify everything, trust no one completely, and always maintain enough independent power to protect myself and my son from anyone who might try to exploit our vulnerabilities. The Aurora Investments strategy was born from this philosophy. Rather than relying on others to support and invest in ventures I believed in, I would create my own investment vehicle that could operate with complete autonomy and secrecy. I would never again be dependent on someone else's goodwill or honest intentions, because I had learned that both could disappear without warning. Over the next 15 years, as I climbed through North Star's executive ranks and built my personal fortune, I applied these lessons with ruthless consistency. I formed strategic alliances based on mutual benefit rather than trust, documented every important agreement and conversation, and maintained multiple backup plans for every significant decision. The irony was that this approach made me extraordinarily successful in business while making genuine personal relationships almost impossible. I had become so skilled at protecting myself from betrayal that I had essentially made myself immune to the kind of deep emotional connections that make life meaningful. But I told myself that the sacrifice was worth it, because I was building something valuable for Damien. My success at North Star, my growing investment portfolio, and my carefully constructed network of professional relationships would give my son opportunities and security that I had never enjoyed. He would never have to depend on anyone else's honesty or goodwill the way I had depended on Robert's. What I failed to consider was that by protecting Damien from every possible vulnerability, I might also be preventing him from developing the character and integrity that would make him worthy of the opportunities I was creating for him. I had assumed that giving him everything he needed would naturally result in his becoming the kind of person who deserved those advantages. 28 years later, sitting in my home office with evidence of his betrayal spread across my desk, I realized that my protective strategy had been a catastrophic failure. In my determination to ensure that Damien would never be anyone's victim, I had accidentally raised him to become someone else's victimizer. The boy I had sworn to protect from the world's cruelties had instead learned to inflict those same cruelties on others, including the mother who had sacrificed everything to give him a better life. The confrontation I had been planning for weeks finally came on a Thursday morning when Damien arrived at my house for what he thought would be another routine family breakfast. He walked into my kitchen with his usual casual arrogance, checking his phone and barely acknowledging my presence as he poured himself coffee from the expensive espresso machine I had bought him for his last birthday. "Morning, Mom," he said absently, scrolling through his messages. "Can we make this quick today? I've got back-to-back meetings with some potential new investors. Really exciting stuff. Way more sophisticated than what we've been working with." The irony of that statement was so perfect that I almost smiled. Instead, I set down my own coffee cup and looked directly at my son. Really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. What I saw was a 30-year-old man in a $2,000 suit, wearing a watch that cost more than most people's annual salary, sitting in a kitchen that I had paid for, discussing business deals that I had funded, while casually insulting the intelligence of the woman who had made his entire lifestyle possible. "Damien," I said quietly, "we need to talk." Something in my tone must have caught his attention because he finally looked up from his phone. "About what?" "If this is about Sunday dinner again, I already told you I might be traveling more often now that the business is expanding." "It's about Aurora Investments," I said, watching his face carefully for any sign of recognition or guilt. He looked blank for a moment, then mildly annoyed. "What about them? Did they send you some kind of communication by mistake? I keep telling their legal team to be more careful about their mailing lists." The casual dismissiveness in his voice was breathtaking. Here was a man discussing his largest investor as if they were an inconvenience he had to manage, rather than the lifeline that had built his entire company. "No mistake," I said, pulling out the leather portfolio I had prepared weeks earlier. "I am Aurora Investments." For a moment, Damien's expression didn't change at all. He stared at me like I had just claimed to be the Queen of England, or announced that I was moving to Mars. Then, slowly, confusion crept across his features. "What do you mean you are Aurora Investments?" he asked, his voice carrying the patient tone someone might use with an elderly relative who had become confused about reality. I opened the portfolio and removed the incorporation documents, placing them on the kitchen table between us. "I mean that I founded Aurora Investments LLC 3 years ago. I am the sole proprietor, the primary decision-maker, and the source of every dollar that has been invested in Pinnacle Digital Solutions." Damien glanced at the documents but didn't pick them up. "Mom, this doesn't make sense. Aurora Investments has invested almost $50 million in my company. You don't have that kind of money." "Actually," I said, removing my North Star retirement portfolio summary and placing it next to the incorporation papers, "I have significantly more than that kind of money. My severance package and stock options from North Star were worth approximately $87 million when I retired. Aurora Investments represents about 60% of my total investment portfolio." Now, Damien did pick up the documents, his hands shaking slightly as he read through the financial statements and legal papers. I watched his face as the reality slowly penetrated his assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. "This can't be real," he said finally. "You live in this house, you drive that old car, you don't live like someone who has this kind of money." "No," I agreed. "I live like someone who understands the difference between wealth and waste. Unlike some people I know." The insult finally broke through his shock, and I saw a flash of anger cross his features. "If this is true," he said, "if you really are Aurora Investments, then why didn't you tell me? Why all the secrecy and games?" "Because," I said, pulling out printed copies of his text messages and emails that my legal team had obtained, "I wanted to see what kind of man you really were when you thought no one was watching. And what I discovered was deeply disappointing." I slid the first document across the table, a transcript of the group chat, where his colleagues had mocked my intelligence and discussed their plans to replace Aurora Investments with Meridian Capital. Damien's face went pale as he read his own words calling Aurora Investments a quote, "free ATM," and describing me as too stupid to understand his business. When he reached the part where Trevor had joked about me giving investment advice based on horoscopes, he actually flinched. "Mom, you have to understand the context of these conversations. We were just blowing off steam. You didn't mean to call your largest investor an amateur who is desperate to be part of your success," I interrupted. "You didn't mean to describe my careful financial guidance as micromanagement. You didn't mean to laugh about how easy it was to take my money while ignoring my advice." I placed another document on the table, the recording transcript of his conversation with Meridian Capital, where he had described Aurora as family money with emotional complications. "Or perhaps you didn't mean to tell potential partners that I don't understand your business, that my investment came with restrictive covenants, and that replacing me would be a strategic upgrade that demonstrates your commitment to working with institutional-grade partners." Damien was now visibly sweating despite the cool morning air. "Mom, you're taking these things out of context." Business conversations aren't always. People say things they don't mean when they're trying to impress. When they're trying to impress investors by lying about their current investors, I corrected. When they're trying to secure new funding by misrepresenting the intelligence and sophistication of the people who believed in them first. I pulled out the final set of documents, the detailed financial analysis showing his unauthorized expenditures, the hidden consulting company he had created to pay himself extra money, and the evidence that he had been systematically ignoring Aurora's strategic recommendations. "But the conversations were just the beginning," I continued. What really opened my eyes was discovering how you've been using my money. The $250,000 marketing campaign that focuses on promoting your personal brand instead of your company's technology. The luxury office space that costs more per month than most people earn in a year. The hiring of unqualified friends and girlfriends at inflated salaries while your actual engineering team works with outdated equipment. Damien's attempts at explanation were becoming increasingly desperate. Those were strategic investments in the company's growth and culture. You can't understand the pressures of running a startup, the need to project success to attract talent and investors. I understand perfectly, I said. I understand that you created a shell company called Hartwell Consulting Group to funnel my money into your personal accounts. I understand that you've been paying yourself unauthorized bonuses while telling Aurora Investments that overhead costs needed to be controlled. I understand that you view my investment not as a partnership based on mutual respect, but as an endless source of funding for your lifestyle with no accountability or oversight. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of Damien's increasingly rapid breathing. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time, which was exactly what was happening. But most of all, I continued, I understand that when I tried to attend your business meeting, when I wanted to learn about the company I had been supporting for 3 years, you publicly humiliated me because you were ashamed to have your sophisticated colleagues meet your supposedly ignorant mother. The woman whose money you've been spending was too stupid to be allowed in the same room where you discussed how to spend more of it. Mom, please, Damien said, his voice breaking. I know how this looks, but you have to believe me. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was trying to protect you from the stress and pressure of the business world. I thought if you knew how much was at stake, how complicated everything was, you'd worry too much. You thought, I said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the garden where I had taught him to plant vegetables when he was 7 years old, that you could steal from me while making me believe I was too stupid to notice. You thought you could take my money, ignore my advice, mock my intelligence, and plan to cheat me out of fair return on my investment, all while maintaining the illusion that you were protecting me from complexity I couldn't handle. When I turned back to face him, Damien was crying, actual tears streaming down his face as the full magnitude of his situation finally became clear. What are you going to do? He whispered. I sat back down at the table and looked at my son, the child I had protected from his father's influence, the young man I had supported through every challenge and setback, the entrepreneur I had believed represented everything good and worthwhile about the next generation. I'm going to show you, I said quietly, exactly how sophisticated Aurora Investments really is. The next 24 hours would become the most decisive period in both our lives, as I systematically dismantled everything Damien had built while teaching him exactly what sophisticated business practices actually looked like. By the time our conversation in the kitchen ended, he was begging for mercy, promising to change, and desperately trying to negotiate some kind of settlement that would allow him to salvage his company and his reputation. Mom, please, he said, his voice hoarse from crying and pleading. I know I made mistakes, but we can fix this. I'll pay back every penny I took inappropriately. I'll give you full board representation. I'll do whatever you want. Just please don't destroy everything I've worked for. I looked at my son, this grown man reduced to tears and desperation, and felt something I hadn't experienced since his father's betrayal, complete emotional detachment. The maternal instinct to protect and forgive had been replaced by the cold calculation of a business executive who had discovered that her investment partner was systematically defrauding her. Damien, I said quietly, you seem to think this is a negotiation. It's not. This is me informing you of decisions I've already made. I walked to my home office and returned with a thick folder of legal documents that my attorneys had prepared over the past week. At 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, Aurora Investments will exercise all buyback clauses in our investment agreements. We are withdrawing our entire $47.3 million investment, plus accrued interest and penalties, effective immediately. Damien's face went white. You can't do that. The buyback clauses have conditions. They require material breach of contract or fundamental changes in business direction. I haven't breached anything. Actually, I said, opening the folder and removing a legal brief that was nearly 50 pages long, you've breached approximately 12 different contractual provisions. Unauthorized expenditures over the specified limits. Failure to provide accurate financial reporting. Creation of undisclosed business entities. Misrepresentation of company performance to third parties. And most significantly, fraudulent diversion of investor funds for personal benefit. I placed the brief in front of him, each page marked with yellow highlighting and detailed annotations. My legal team has documented every violation with supporting evidence. Any one of these breaches would justify immediate withdrawal of investment. Collectively, they constitute grounds for criminal fraud charges. Criminal charges? Damien's voice cracked. Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your son. Yes, I agreed. You're my son who has been stealing from me for months while laughing about my stupidity with your colleagues. The family relationship that you thought would protect you from consequences is exactly why your actions are so unconscionable. I sat back down across from him, my voice taking on the same tone I had used during the most difficult business negotiations of my career. But here's what's going to happen next, and I want you to listen very carefully, because these terms are non-negotiable. Damien wiped his eyes and leaned forward, clearly hoping that some vestige of maternal mercy would save him from complete destruction. First, I continued, Aurora Investments will announce the withdrawal of our funding at exactly 9 a.m. tomorrow. Our legal notice will be delivered simultaneously to Pinnacle Digital Solutions, Meridian Capital, Takeshi Yamamoto Corporation, and every other investor or partner you've been courting. The notice will include a detailed explanation of why we are terminating our relationship, including specific examples of financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. That will destroy any chance of raising replacement funding, Damien protested. No serious investor will touch a company that's been accused of fraud by its largest backer. That's correct, I said. Which brings us to the second part of your education. By tomorrow afternoon, every major player in the tech investment community will know that Pinnacle Digital Solutions has been flagged for financial irregularities by a $47 million investor. Your reputation in this industry will be finished. But the accusations, you could structure this differently. You could say it was a strategic realignment, or a shift in investment priorities. You don't have to destroy me publicly. I smiled, and even I was surprised by how cold it felt. Damien, do you remember what you said to Meridian Capital about Aurora Investments being family money with emotional complications? Do you remember laughing about how Aurora was too unsophisticated to understand your business model? He nodded miserably. Well, this is what sophisticated business practices actually look like. When you discover that a partner has been systematically defrauding you, you don't quietly restructure the relationship to save their feelings. You expose the misconduct publicly to protect other potential investors from the same deception. You use every legal remedy at your disposal to recover your losses and ensure that the fraudulent party faces appropriate consequences. I pulled out another document, a press release that my publicity team had drafted for distribution to major business media outlets. This announcement will be sent to TechCrunch, Business Insider, Fortune, and 12 other publications at exactly noon tomorrow. It will detail Aurora Investments' reasons for withdrawing funding from Pinnacle, including specific examples of financial misconduct and unauthorized expenditures. Damien read the press release, his face growing paler with each paragraph. The language was professionally neutral, but devastatingly clear about the nature of his violations. Any investor or business partner who read it would immediately understand that Pinnacle Digital Solutions was too risky to associate with. "This will ruin me," he whispered. "Yes," I agreed. "It will. Just like you tried to ruin Aurora Investments by misrepresenting our sophistication to Meridian Capital." The difference is that my reputation can survive being called unsophisticated by someone who doesn't know better. Your reputation cannot survive being exposed as a fraud by someone who has documented evidence of your misconduct. What about the company? What about the employees who depend on Pinnacle for their jobs? Are you going to destroy their livelihoods just to punish me? For a moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. But then I remembered the engineering team that had been working with inadequate resources, while Damien spent lavishly on office luxuries and personal perks. The employees will be fine, I said. In fact, they'll be better off. I've already arranged for North Star Enterprises to acquire Pinnacle's core technology and intellectual property. They'll offer employment to every member of your engineering team at salaries significantly higher than what you've been paying them. Damien stared at me in shock. You're stealing my company. I'm not stealing anything, I corrected. I'm executing a carefully planned business strategy. North Star will purchase Pinnacle's assets through the bankruptcy proceedings that will begin next week when you're unable to meet your financial obligations without Aurora's funding. The purchase price will be sufficient to cover your debts to other creditors, but there won't be anything left for you or your management team. And the employees I actually care about, the ones doing the real work, instead of inflating their salaries and living off investor money, will have secure positions with a stable company that invests in technology rather than lifestyle branding. I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where I poured myself another cup of coffee with hands that were perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what I was orchestrating. There is one alternative, I said, returning to the table. You can try to fight this. You can hire attorneys, challenge the buyback clauses, claim that Aurora's withdrawal is unjustified or retaliatory. You can attempt to raise emergency funding from other sources, or convince Meridian Capital that our accusations are motivated by family drama rather than legitimate business concerns. Damien looked up with something that might have been hope. But if you choose that path, I continued, I will stop treating this as a civil business dispute and start treating it as criminal fraud. I will turn over all evidence of your financial misconduct to the district attorney's office and the Securities and Exchange Commission. I will personally testify about every misrepresented fact and every unauthorized expenditure. And I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure that you face the full legal consequences of stealing from your investors. The hope died in his eyes as quickly as it had appeared. So your choice is simple, I concluded. You can accept the controlled demolition of your company and reputation that allows you to walk away with your freedom and the possibility of rebuilding your life eventually. Or you can fight me and risk spending the next several years in federal prison for securities fraud. Damien sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the legal documents spread across my kitchen table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. How long have you been planning this? Since the moment I realized that you view your largest investor as too stupid to deserve basic respect, I replied. Everything that happens from this point forward is a direct consequence of decisions you made when you thought I would never be smart enough to discover what you were doing. I never meant for it to go this far, he said weakly. No, I agreed. You meant for it to go much further. You meant to replace me with Meridian Capital, cheat me out of fair return on my investment, and continue spending my money while laughing about my ignorance with your colleagues. The only thing you didn't mean was to get caught. As I watched my son finally understand the full consequences of his actions, I realized that this moment would define not just the end of his business career, but the beginning of my complete emotional independence from the last person on earth who had the power to hurt me through love. 6 months after I destroyed my son's business empire, I was sitting in the executive conference room of Aurora Investments' new headquarters in downtown Riverside City, reviewing quarterly reports that showed our portfolio had grown to over $93 million. The irony wasn't lost on me that the money Damien had dismissed as family funds from an unsophisticated investor was now generating returns that exceeded the annual revenue of most Fortune 500 companies. The transformation of my life during those 6 months had been as dramatic as anything I had experienced during my early years at North Star. For the first time in decades, I was living entirely for myself, making decisions based on my own interests and values rather than trying to protect or support people who had no appreciation for my sacrifices. The liberation was intoxicating. Aurora Investments had evolved from a secret shell company designed to help my son into a legitimate venture capital firm with a growing reputation for identifying breakthrough technologies and supporting entrepreneurs who had been overlooked by traditional investors. My decision to go public with the company after withdrawing from Pinnacle had attracted attention from business media, potential partners, and dozens of startup founders who were eager to work with an investor who understood both the technical and financial aspects of building sustainable businesses. The key to Aurora's success was the same philosophy that had guided my career at North Star, finding extraordinary potential in places where others saw only risk or failure. But now I was applying that philosophy with the wisdom that comes from understanding how easily trust can be betrayed, and how important it is to verify character as well as capability. My first major investment after the Pinnacle disaster was a company called Neural Pathways, founded by Dr. Priya Chakrabarty, a brilliant neuroscientist who had been struggling to find funding for her revolutionary brain-computer interface technology. Traditional investors had dismissed her work as too experimental and her timeline as too ambitious, but I recognized the same kind of overlooked genius that I had seen in the Lumiere Technologies deal decades earlier. The difference was that this time, I conducted exhaustive background research on Dr. Chakrabarty's character, work ethic, and personal integrity before committing a single dollar. I interviewed her former colleagues, professors, and even undergraduate students she had mentored. I hired private investigators to verify every detail of her academic and professional history. I spent 3 months observing how she treated her employees, managed stress, and responded to setbacks. What I discovered was a woman of extraordinary brilliance and uncompromising ethics who had been repeatedly underestimated by male colleagues and investors who couldn't see past their own biases. Dr. Chakrabarty's technology had the potential to revolutionize treatment for paralysis, depression, and dozens of neurological conditions, but she needed an investor who understood both the scientific complexity and the long-term commercial potential. Aurora's $12 million investment in Neural Pathways had already generated preliminary results that were attracting interest from major pharmaceutical companies and medical research institutions. More importantly, Dr. Chakrabarty had proven to be exactly the kind of partner I had hoped to find: brilliant, honest, grateful for support, and completely committed to using her success to benefit others. The second major investment was even more personally satisfying. Sustainable Solutions, Inc. was a green technology company founded by Maria Santos, a former Pinnacle Digital Solutions engineer, who had been working with outdated equipment while Damien spent lavishly on office luxuries. When North Star acquired Pinnacle's assets, Maria had approached me directly with a proposal for developing solar energy storage systems that could make renewable power practical for residential use. Maria's pitch was everything that Damien's business model had never been: technically sophisticated, financially realistic, focused on solving actual problems rather than promoting personal brands. She had spent 2 years developing prototypes using her own savings and working nights and weekends while supporting her family on her Pinnacle salary. Her dedication and technical expertise reminded me of my own early years at North Star, when I had worked tirelessly to prove my worth despite being underestimated by colleagues and supervisors. Aurora's $8 million investment had allowed Maria to hire a team of top engineers, lease proper research facilities, and accelerate development of her storage technology. Within 4 months, Sustainable Solutions had produced prototypes that outperformed existing systems while costing 30% less to manufacture. 3 major utility companies were now negotiating contracts that would make Maria's technology a standard component of residential solar installations. But the most rewarding aspect of working with Neural Pathways and Sustainable Solutions wasn't the financial returns, it was the relationship dynamic. Both Dr. Chakrabarty and Maria treated Aurora Investments as a valued partner whose guidance and expertise contributed to their success. They sought my advice on strategic decisions, incorporated my suggestions into their business plans, and expressed genuine gratitude for the support that had made their dreams possible. The contrast with Damien's attitude toward Aurora was so stark that it felt like living in a completely different universe. These entrepreneurs viewed my investment as the beginning of a collaborative relationship, rather than the end of their independence. They understood that accepting money from sophisticated investors meant accepting responsibility for using that money wisely and maintaining the highest standards of transparency and accountability. Perhaps most importantly, both women had backgrounds that made them genuinely appreciate the opportunity to work with someone who understood their industries and could provide strategic guidance beyond simple funding. Dr. Chakrabarty had spent years being dismissed by venture capital firms that couldn't evaluate the scientific merit of her research. Maria had watched Damien waste millions of dollars on ego projects, while her legitimate engineering work was starved of resources. They knew the difference between investors who added value and investors who simply wrote checks. The success of these partnerships had attracted other opportunities that allowed me to expand Aurora's influence and impact. I had been invited to speak at technology conferences, serve on advisory boards for emerging companies, and consult with established corporations that were struggling to evaluate innovative but risky technologies. My reputation as an investor who could identify potential in overlooked ventures had made Aurora Investments one of the most sought-after partners in the tech industry. But the personal transformation was even more significant than the professional success. For the first time since my divorce from Robert, I was building relationships based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than family obligations or social expectations. Dr. Chakrabarty and Maria had become genuine friends, whose company I enjoyed even outside of our business relationships. We shared meals, discussed books, and supported each other through both professional challenges and personal milestones. The difference between these authentic connections and the manipulative relationships I had endured with Robert and Damien was like the difference between sunlight and artificial illumination. I had forgotten what it felt like to be valued for my actual contributions rather than tolerated despite perceived inadequacies. I had also discovered the profound satisfaction that comes from using wealth and influence to support people who genuinely deserve success. Instead of funding the lifestyle fantasies of someone who viewed my investment as free money, I was helping brilliant, hardworking entrepreneurs achieve goals that would benefit thousands of other people. The neural pathways technology would restore mobility to paralyzed patients. The sustainable solutions systems would make clean energy accessible to families who couldn't afford traditional solar installations. My money was finally being used to create something meaningful rather than subsidize someone's ego and entitlement. The $47 million I had withdrawn from Pinnacle was now generating returns while supporting ventures that would make the world a better place. Aurora Investments had become the kind of company I had always wanted to build: profitable, ethical, and focused on identifying and nurturing genuine innovation. Most surprisingly, I had found that success without family complications was infinitely more satisfying than success achieved while trying to protect or please people who didn't appreciate my efforts. The emotional energy I had spent managing Damien's career and shielding him from consequences was now available for building something that reflected my own values and priorities. For the first time in my adult life, I was living according to my own definition of success, rather than trying to fulfill someone else's expectations or compensate for someone else's failures. The freedom was extraordinary, and I realized that I had spent decades underestimating my own capacity for happiness when it wasn't constrained by family obligations to people who didn't deserve my loyalty. 2 years after I walked away from Damien, I received a phone call that provided the final vindication of every decision I had made during the most difficult period of my life. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon as I was reviewing proposals for Aurora Investments' newest fund, which had grown to over $120 million and was attracting interest from institutional investors across 3 continents. "Ms. Hartwell," said the voice on the other end of the line, "this is Rebecca Martinez from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. We need to speak with you about your former investment in Pinnacle Digital Solutions." The investigation that followed revealed that Damien's financial misconduct had been far more extensive than even I had discovered. After losing Aurora's funding, he had attempted to save his company by fabricating financial records, inflating revenue projections, and outright lying to potential investors about Pinnacle's technological capabilities and market position. The desperation that followed his public humiliation had led him to cross lines that transformed his business incompetence into actual criminal behavior. What the FBI investigation uncovered was a pattern of securities fraud that had continued for over a year after I withdrew my investment. Damien had managed to raise nearly $8 million from a group of private investors by presenting them with completely falsified financial statements that claimed Pinnacle was profitable and growing rapidly. He had hired actors to pose as satisfied customers during investor presentations and created fake contracts with non-existent companies to support his revenue claims. The most damning evidence came from his own communications, which federal investigators obtained through search warrants. In emails and text messages with Cassandra Vail and Trevor Blackstone, Damien had explicitly discussed strategies for managing investor expectations and creative accounting approaches that would allow them to continue funding their lifestyle while buying time to develop an actual viable business model. "We'll just tell them what they want to hear," he had written to Cassandra. "Rich people who invest in tech startups don't really understand the technology anyway. They're buying into the story and the potential, not the current reality." Even more disturbing was a recorded phone conversation where Damien had described his plans for using the fraudulent funding to relocate Pinnacle's operations to a country without extradition treaties, effectively stealing millions of dollars from American investors before disappearing permanently. "The beauty of it," he had told Trevor, "is that by the time anyone figures out what's really happening, we'll be operating under a completely different legal jurisdiction. These Silicon Valley investors are so arrogant about their due diligence that they never bother to verify anything we tell them." The federal charges that resulted from this investigation were comprehensive and devastating. Damien was indicted on 14 counts of securities fraud, 7 counts of wire fraud, 4 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud, and 2 counts of money laundering. Cassandra and Trevor were charged as co-conspirators, and all 3 were facing potential prison sentences of up to 25 years. But what provided the most satisfaction was learning how my early withdrawal from Pinnacle had actually protected other investors from much greater losses. The FBI's analysis showed that if Aurora Investments had remained as Damien's primary funding source, his fraudulent schemes would likely have grown much larger and affected many more victims. My decision to expose his misconduct publicly had served as an early warning that prevented several major investment firms from losing tens of millions of dollars. "Your actions probably saved the retirement funds of thousands of people," Agent Martinez explained during one of our meetings. If Damien had succeeded in raising the kind of institutional funding he was targeting, the eventual collapse would have destroyed pension funds, university endowments, and individual investors across the country. The trial, when it finally took place, was a masterclass in how thoroughly someone can destroy their own life through arrogance and entitlement. Damien's attorneys attempted to argue that he was a naive entrepreneur who had been overwhelmed by the pressures of running a startup and had made poor decisions without criminal intent. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming, and Damien's own words had provided a complete record of his deliberate fraud. When I was called to testify about Aurora Investments' experience with Pinnacle, I found myself facing my son across a federal courtroom for the first time since our confrontation in my kitchen. He looked like he had aged a decade in 2 years, thin, pale, wearing an ill-fitting public defender's suit instead of the expensive clothing I had unknowingly funded. During my testimony, I was asked to explain why I had withdrawn Aurora's investment and whether I had suspected criminal activity at the time. "I suspected financial incompetence and ethical deficiencies," I said, looking directly at Damien as I spoke. The criminal behavior became apparent only when he was desperate enough to believe that lying to federal regulators was a viable business strategy. The prosecutor asked me to elaborate on the impact of Damien's actions on Aurora Investments and my personal confidence in the tech industry. The financial impact was minimal, I replied. Aurora recovered its investment and has since generated far better returns by partnering with entrepreneurs who understand that investor money comes with responsibilities, not just opportunities. As for my confidence in the industry, it's actually stronger than ever. Working with ethical partners has shown me that there are many brilliant, honest people building innovative companies. My son's behavior was an aberration, not a representative example. When the prosecutor asked whether I felt any regret about exposing Damien's misconduct, I paused for a moment before answering. I regret that I didn't recognize his character flaws earlier, I said. If I had been more perceptive about his attitude toward responsibility and accountability, I might have been able to prevent him from involving other investors in his schemes. My responsibility as an investor is to make decisions based on evidence and analysis, not hope and wishful thinking. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Damien was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 years if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation and made full restitution to his victims. Cassandra received 10 years, and Trevor got 7 years as the least culpable member of the conspiracy. But the real vindication came in the months following the trial, as Aurora Investments continued to thrive and gain recognition as one of the most successful venture capital firms on the West Coast. Dr. Chakrabarty's neural pathways technology had been licensed by 3 major pharmaceutical companies and was beginning clinical trials that could help millions of patients with neurological conditions. Maria Santos's sustainable solutions had secured contracts worth over $200 million and was revolutionizing residential solar energy storage. Both women had been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine in an article about female entrepreneurs who were changing the world with breakthrough technologies. The article mentioned Aurora Investments as the sophisticated and strategic partner who had recognized their potential when other investors were too conservative or short-sighted to see the opportunities. I kept a copy of that Forbes cover in my office, not because I needed validation, but because it represented everything I had learned about the difference between supporting genuine innovation and funding entitled mediocrity. Dr. Chakrabarty and Maria had earned their success through brilliance, hard work, and integrity. They appreciated Aurora's support because they understood how difficult it was to find investors who could provide both funding and strategic guidance. Most importantly, they had never made me feel like I was too stupid to understand their business, too unsophisticated to contribute to their success, or too naive to deserve transparency about how my money was being used. They treated me as a valued partner because they recognized that I was exactly that. On the 5-year anniversary of my confrontation with Damien, I hosted a celebration dinner for Aurora Investments portfolio companies and their founders. 37 entrepreneurs attended, representing over $400 million in successful ventures that were creating jobs, solving problems, and generating returns that exceeded every projection. As I looked around the room at these brilliant, ethical, hardworking people who had built extraordinary companies with Aurora's support, I realized that the most valuable lesson from my experience with Damien wasn't about the importance of due diligence or character assessment in business relationships. It was about the profound liberation that comes from refusing to accept disrespect from people who should be grateful for your support. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to walk away from someone who doesn't appreciate your value, even when that person is your own child. I had learned that family love without accountability is just enabling, that supporting someone's dreams doesn't require tolerating their contempt, and that the people who truly deserve your investment will never make you question your own intelligence or worth. At 68 years old, I was finally living the life I had built for myself, surrounded by people who saw my success as inspiration rather than intimidation, who viewed my wealth as a tool for creating positive change rather than a resource to be exploited, and who understood that respect is something you earn through character and integrity, not something you inherit through blood relations. Damien had called me too stupid for his business meeting, never knowing that I was the most sophisticated investor he would ever encounter. The irony was perfect, the justice was complete, and the lesson was one that I hoped other parents would learn before it was too late. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your child is to let them face the consequences of treating you with contempt. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.